They said it wasn't humanly possible. But now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Plus, Game Boy comes with the outrageous new game, Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use the revolutionary video link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
Why do the most powerful handheld consoles always lose the console wars to their less powerful rivals? This is the question we seek to explore and answer in today's follow-up to our last video exploration of why the most powerful home consoles always lose to less powerful home consoles. If you've not seen that discussion, I'd encourage you to check it out once you've seen this video focused on the handheld side of things. Today we'll be looking at all of the major handheld consoles from the Game Boy to the Game Gear, PSP, PlayStation Vita, Nintendo 3DS, Switch and Steam Deck. Do the more powerful consoles always lose? And if so, why?
Where you been, pal? You don't return my calls.
I've been kind of busy.
Taking pictures of your friend.
If you haven't done so already, don't forget to smash that subscribe button to support the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel, and make sure you give us a like and leave us a comment to help the channel grow. So, is that power in your pocket, or are you just pleased to see me? Our story starts in 1979, during an era in which the video game world was ruled by the arcades and Atari was #1 brand in the home console space. 10 years before Nintendo would release their first handheld console, the Game Boy, Milton Bradley released the Microvision. Designed by J. Smith, who had also designed the Vectrex, the Microvision was the first handheld console that allowed players to change what game could be played on it.
Tired of doing the same old thing every night? Well, light up those nights with Microvision, Milton Bradley's great new handheld electronic game system.
The system was incredibly basic, but it would inspire Nintendo with their later Game Boy. Before the Microvision, there had been a few handheld games that used LED lights rather than LCD screens. Nintendo would start releasing their Game & Watch LCDs from 1980, and although not technically consoles as they were standalone games, these would prove to be more successful than the Microvision, which only ever had 12 games released for it and fizzled out after a couple of years. With Nintendo finding success with the NES throughout the mid to late 1980s, they were the first to release a new dedicated handheld console that could have interchangeable games released for it. An evolution of the Game & Watch games, the Game Boy displayed games in a kind of green and black.
We're giving you more power and mightier weapons to search a bigger world where hundreds of strange enemy life forms lurk. Destroy or be destroyed.
Unlike LCD games which just lit up set animation panels to give the illusion of movement on screen, the Game Boy could display whatever graphics were programmed for each game. Nintendo weren't the only company aiming to make a handheld gaming console, however, and their first rival was the Atari Lynx, which released within a few months of Nintendo's Game Boy.
Oh yes! Oh yes! I'm in the team! Oh yes!
So where you been, pal? You don't return my calls.
I've been kind of busy.
With much more power under the hood and a colour screen to boot. Compared to the Game Boy's 4 shades of green, the Atari Lynx was instantly more impressive, but it lost this first handheld console war. The reasons for Atari's loss were many. With the Lynx being much more powerful than the Game Boy, there were several drawbacks.
In over 4,000 colors. Stereo sound on the largest portable video game screen in the world.
Firstly, the price. The Lynx debuted at $179.99 in the United States, whilst the Game Boy was only $89.99 USD. The price was undoubtedly a main factor, as parents could much more easily afford a Game Boy for their children, and due to the portable nature of the console, if they had multiple children who each wanted a Game Boy, they could actually get 2 Game Boys for the price of one Lynx. 1989 was also a time where Nintendo meant video games, and Atari, which used to mean video games to the general public, was a now somewhat tarnished brand. The Atari 2600, which had released a whole decade earlier, was still Atari's most popular console, with the Atari 5200 being a bit of a disaster, and the 7800 releasing late and with few games as compared to the rival NES. The next reason the Lynx couldn't compete with the Game Boy was battery life. In an age where these consoles required AA batteries and weren't rechargeable as modern consoles and controllers are, owning a handheld console effectively meant an ongoing subscription of batteries to be able to keep playing your new games on the go. The extra power of the Lynx and the colour screen meant that the Atari handheld would chew through batteries much faster than the humble Game Boy would. The Lynx would need 6 AA batteries and only give about 5 hours of gameplay, compared to the Game Boy giving you 15 hours of gameplay on just 4 batteries.
Racked with attraction, stacked with more games for total satisfaction. It'll blow you away.
To equal out this measurement a little bit more, with 12 batteries you could get a maximum of 10 hours out of the Atari Lynx, or 45 out of the Game Boy. This was a near slam dunk win for the Game Boy in terms of perception of being a player-friendly console. The last major factor was the games. Both Atari and Nintendo had some classic game franchises to lean upon, but Atari elected not to for some reason. I mean, these days, when most people think of Atari, they think of Centipede, Pong, Breakout, Missile Command, and Asteroids. Of these franchises, only the last 2 ever actually came out on the Lynx, and when they did, they were together on what was the final release for the system in 1995. Nintendo, meanwhile, launched the Game Boy with Super Mario Land as the big franchise game to draw in the NES players, and they also launched with Tetris, which was the addictive puzzle game which captured everyone's imaginations and literally infected their dreams. Chip's Challenge was fun, but it couldn't compete with Tetris. The combination of a cheaper price, better battery life, and hit franchise games for the Game Boy meant Nintendo easily beat the Lynx.
Introducing Lynx from Atari, the color video game you can get away with. Well, sometimes.
But Nintendo's arch nemesis was also about to enter the handheld arena.
Color. Hey, there's an easier way to get color. Get a Game Gear, the full color portable with over 150 games, like the new Echo, Mortal 2, and Sonic Triple Trouble.
Sega released the Game Gear in 1990 in Japan and 1991 elsewhere. Whilst the Game Gear was much more successful than the Lynx was, it was dogged by many of the same issues. Launching at $149.99, it was cheaper than the Lynx at launch, but you could still get the Game Boy, which would come packaged with Tetris, for much cheaper. Sega also launched a system that would require 6 AA batteries, but could only deliver 3 to 5 hours of playtime.
Attention consumers, certain portable gaming systems are being dressed up in order to distract the buyer from their ordinary one-color play. What could be next? Little flower print dresses? Black leather restraining devices? Fresh baked olive loaf?
This, along with the price, was probably the biggest killer of the Game Gear's success. I mean, if you have a console but can't afford to keep buying the batteries to play it, the system becomes useless. Another slight point here is that even though the original Game Boy was quite a chunky little beast on its own, the Game Gear and the Lynx were ginormous. Like, the Game Boy could fit in your pocket if you really wanted it to, but the others no chance. Sega did have a few aces up its sleeve though. The Game Gear was essentially a portable Sega Master System, and this meant that games that were developed for one could easily have carts also released on the other system. This ensured that developers, including Sega themselves, could get more bang for their buck by making games for the Master System and Game Gear, and inevitably there would be some players who would end up double dipping and buying both versions of the game. Smart players may have just elected to buy the Master System versions, however, as you could also get an adapter to play actual Master System carts on the Game Gear. Sega could also leverage their arcade games to put known franchises on the handheld, and within a few months of launch, Sega were also able to launch their biggest hit in Sonic the Hedgehog. Truthfully, the Master System and Game Gear versions of Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 are absolutely nothing compared to the Mega Drive games. But back in the day, if this was the only way you had to experience Sonic, it was still Sonic. But alas for Sega though, the battery and cost issues were the biggest losing factors for them. Nintendo also filled out their libraries with new entries of The Legend of Zelda and Metroid series, and follow-ups to Super Mario Land. The Game Boy's graphics may have been poor, but the games were unbeatable. Nintendo did have another prominent rival during the earliest days of the Game Boy, and that came in the form of the Turboxpress, also known as the PC Engine GT. The Turboxpress had a major ace up its sleeve compared to its rivals, and that was that the console was actually just a portable version of the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 home console, and allowed you to plug in the exact same hue cards as you would use on the home console. The Game Gear let you play Master System games on the handheld, but you needed that adapter for this to work. Being based on the home console, which itself was a midway point between an 8 and 16-bit console, the PC Engine or Turboxpress, whichever version you had, was significantly more capable than the Game Boy. Once again, it's the same old story, that a much higher price and the need of 6 batteries that ran out fast meant that it couldn't compete with either the Game Boy or the Game Gear. Both the Turboxpress and Game Gear got TV tuner add-ons, which allowed you to turn the devices into mini TVs, which was very cool in theory, but the signal always kinda sucked. As a personal note on this, the best thing I ever used my TV tuner for was that I found that I could plug a cable from my N64 into the Game Gear TV tuner and play Super Mario 64 on that tiny screen. Now I bet not many of you have ever tried that. You need the right cable for it to work, but when you find one, wow, that's magic. As the 1990s progressed, the gaming landscape transitioned from the NES versus the Master System to the Super NES versus the Mega Drive. The handheld console war had started a few years later than the 8-bit home console wars, so there was no signs that the handheld consoles were going to be replaced throughout most of the 90s. In 1995, Nintendo released the Virtual Boy.
It came from the third dimension, with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes.
Which I did have a moment's hesitation about including in this discussion, because it's arguably not a handheld console. The Virtual Boy is a tabletop console, and its design had you lean your head into its visor. I will include it in the discussion, as it's most definitely not a home console, and as it runs off batteries and doesn't need to be tethered to a television, it can technically be used anywhere from a camping site to a plane or a train ride. So it is definitely portable, if not quite handhelds, and I use the term portable loosely. The 32-bit Virtual Boy was like the Game Boy in that it wasn't full colour, and instead of being swamp green and black, it was red and black. That they never released a Terminator game on the console is one of gaming's great missed opportunities. Being an owner of a Virtual Boy, I look forward to making an in-depth video on the console another day. But needless to say, most people already know the main bullet points of its story. It was Nintendo's biggest ever flop. It looked like a VR headset, but didn't actually have head tracking or motion controls to make it true virtual reality. It was just a way to have a 3D display long before the Nintendo 3DS. It was expensive, and the games didn't look that different than if they were just red and black SNES games, despite this being a 32-bit gaming device that came out within a year of the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. It was a disaster of a product that was rushed out to bridge the gap between the SNES and the N64, but potentially did harm to the Nintendo name just as the 32X hurt Sega.
Wait till they get a load of me!
The Game Boy lost a lot of momentum in the mid-90s. Donkey Kong would add a bit of oomph to it, firstly with Nintendo's Donkey Kong 94, as it's known, and then the trilogy of Rare's Donkey Kong Land games. Nintendo would release the Super Game Boy, which did the reverse of what Sega and the PC Engine did to allow you to play portable games on the big screen, instead of big screen games on the portable. This was the first way I owned and played Game Boy games before I actually owned the handheld itself. This was Nintendo's first step towards making a colour Game Boy, as Super Game Boy enhanced games that would have more colours than when played on the Game Boy itself. Nintendo probably saw the opportunity to leverage Game Boy owners to want to play their Game Boy games in colour and on the big screen as a way to get more players to buy a Super Nintendo if they currently just owned a Game Boy. Let's not forget that the Game Boy outsold the Super Nintendo by a long way. This also meant there was extra value to Game Boy games, as the carts could be played on both the SNES and the Game Boy. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are expecting me to touch on the Pokemon-shaped elephant in the Game Boy room.
Hey, little buddy, wanna ride? Pikachu! Yeah, whatever!
Well, that's coming, but not quite yet. The original Game Boy lasted a long time, and actually outlasted other competitors along the way before we get to Pokemania. Tiger Electronics, who was the main rival to Nintendo in the LCD Game & Watch space, had a couple of stabs at releasing portable consoles, and both are worth talking about. Firstly, there was the Tiger R-Zone, which is a series of devices that allowed you to buy various games that came on cartridges, but the games were basically just LCD games. You could change the games, but each game cart had a screen that was used in conjunction with a mirror to reflect the games as part of how they were displayed. The original version of the device was something you'd wear attached to your head and would have a display in front of one of your eyes. With its red display and close launch to the Virtual Boy, it's probable that the device was intended to somewhat rip off and capitalise on the hype around Nintendo's headset. Yes, actually, this tried to leech off of the Virtual Boy. Further versions were more traditional handhelds, or looked like a mini arcade machine, and all of them failed despite Tiger having licenses to lots and lots of big franchises, including Sega games. The era of the LCD games was pretty much over, as although lots of new LCD games were produced in the 1990s, primarily by Tiger, the types of games you could make on these devices couldn't compete with what could now be achieved on the likes of the Game Boy, Game Gear, Turboxpress and Lynx. But once again, as I noted in the video about home consoles, this isn't an argument that the least powerful console always wins, but that the most powerful console doesn't. In the case of the Tiger R-Zone, it was very underpowered, but it also didn't have very much to offer either. Sega wouldn't ever release a proper follow-up to the Game Gear, but would take one more stab at releasing a handheld console. That was the Sega Nomad. The Nomad was a portable Sega Genesis that was only released in the United States. Coming out in 1995, it was instantly the most powerful handheld of its time. But once again, it failed. The Nomad had the exact same issues as the Game Gear in that it was too expensive, too bulky, and once again it was a full colour handheld that needed 6 batteries to run and would chew through those batteries faster than Sonic would munch on a chili dog.
You said it, not me!
I hate chili dogs! And I hate that hedgehog!
Beyond this, it was a portable Genesis in 1995, when Sega was much more focused on the Sega Saturn at the expense of literally everything else, which included the Mega CD, the 32X, and indeed the Nomad. Like the Turboxpress, the plus point of the Nomad was that it could just play the same carts as the company's home console. But this meant there wasn't a specific unique game to make anyone rush out to have to go and buy the Nomad. It should also be noted that the Nomad just released in the United States, and Sega of Japan and Sega of America were about as close as Cain and Abel. With years of rival handhelds, Nintendo would eventually release the smaller Game Boy Pocket in late 1996. With a smaller form factor and improved battery life, now only needing 2 AAA batteries instead of 4 AA batteries, the console also had a better screen, which was now actually black and white, rather than that disgusting green colour. This released a few months after the release of Pocket Monster's red and green versions in Japan.
私のポケットモンスターと勝負しない？
あんただれ？
モンスター全部で150種類。通信ケーブルでモンスター取り替えっこ。スーパーゲームボーイならカラーで綺麗。仲間が増えるロールプレイング。ポケットモンスター。赤を買うか緑を買うかちょっと違うよ。
And although it'd take another couple of years to come to the West, the launch of Pokemon worldwide would revitalise the Game Boy in ways that not even Nintendo could have imagined. With Nintendo showing renewed interest in the handheld market, things would really start to heat up again. The next challenger to the Game Boy is the Tiger Gamecom, and its revision, the Gamecom Pocket Pro. Released in 1997, Tiger clearly had learned a lot from their flop that was the R-Zone. The Gamecom was a true video game system like the Game Boy.
Gamecom! Lay those bloodshot eyes on these babies! It speaks!
Let's rock.
Begs to be touched! Wires you to the internet! And it plays more games than you idiots have brain cells!
And was the first challenger to see the sense in not just fighting with a colour screen and being so powerful that it would require 6 batteries that would drain very quickly. Instead, the Gamecom only needed 4 batteries, and then the Pocket Pro only 2. This new console was innovative. The Gamecom featured the ability to connect to the internet. It had PDA-like features, and it had a touchscreen 7 whole years before the release of the Nintendo DS. Tiger also secured the rights to have the first handheld versions of Resident Evil 2 and Duke Nukem 3D, and also had the likes of Mortal Kombat Trilogy and Sonic Jam on the console. The console was also under $70 USD at launch. So in every way imaginable, Tiger had looked at the mistakes of their competitors and released a system that could fight the Game Boy at its own game. I mean, this sounds fantastic, in theory, but in practice, the screen of the Gamecom was terrible. And most agree that the software was actually fairly poor. Tiger didn't even let other companies produce the games, and they'd just buy the license to Mortal Kombat or Resident Evil and produce the games themselves, and this led there being very few games and fairly poor games. Only around 20 games were released for the console across the 3 years it was available. Not even the cheaper Pocket Pro, which was smaller, had a better screen and used less batteries, could help it, as this was too little too late. The brand was finished by this stage. Even though Gamecom failed, it was the first sign of the competition learning that brute force alone wasn't going to help them win the console war. Colour screens, short battery life, and too much power under the hood all drove up the cost, and this was a recipe for disaster. And the next two competitors would avoid that whilst delivering a better product than Tiger had.
I'm not the boy.
I'm not the boy.
I'm not the boy.
I'm not the boy.
Neo Geo Pocket から新登場。
SNK, who were known for their arcade games and the Neo Geo consoles, released the Neo Geo Pocket in 1998. SNK certainly had the gaming pedigree that was better than Tiger's, but would this be enough? Bandai would also enter the handheld console race with the Wonderswan, which was released only in Japan. This console is significant for being a console from the makers of the hit Tamagotchi and Digimon Virtual Pets, which themselves were effectively small gaming devices. More significantly though, the console was worked on by Gunpei Yokoi, who was the man most famous as the creator of the Game Boy. He was also responsible for the creation of the Virtual Boy, and when that flopped, he left Nintendo. Both of these consoles were 16-bit and would feature better battery life and a cheaper price point than any of the Game Boy's previous rivals. They, along with the Gamecom, were all systems that had black and white displays, just like the Game Boy. Right? Well, in 1998, Nintendo changed the rules and released the first true successor to the Game Boy with the Game Boy Color. The hardware for the Game Boy Color was mostly the same, but games could now be designed in full color. Just as competitors had realised that Nintendo had garnered success in part by avoiding a colour screen, Nintendo now used one themselves. This meant that SNK and Bandai had to quickly release colour versions of their systems, and the Neo Geo Pocket Color and Wonderswan Color quickly followed. Impressive games across the systems like SNK vs Capcom on the Neo Geo and Final Fantasy on the Wonderswan didn't mean anything though, as Nintendo had discovered their biggest asset since the Fat Plumber when they unleashed Pokemon worldwide between 1996 and 1999. With the dual release of Pokemon Red and Blue, where players would collect and swap monsters exclusive between versions with their friends, the games made the original black and white Game Boy more successful than it had even been when it first launched with Tetris. Nintendo didn't need the most powerful system when it had the most powerful game franchise in the world. With the writing on the wall, the Neo Geo Pocket Color only lasted a few months, and the Wonderswan was a minor success in Japan, but wasn't released worldwide. Nintendo have always clubbed the Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Light and Game Boy Color sales together, and I'd disagree that the Color should be seen as the same, as it had enough exclusive games that weren't backwards compatible with the OG GB that it should have been its own thing. Regardless, Nintendo had once again seen off its competition. In fact, it had now won. There was no future competitors to the Game Boy and Game Boy Color from rivals. In the writing of this discussion, I found that the reign of the original lineup of Game Boy consoles was so long and its win so decisive that it almost feels more of an exploration of how the Game Boy was able to beat its rivals rather than that the more powerful consoles didn't win. Only the Tiger R-Zone was arguably a less powerful console, and everything else was more powerful than Game Boy. But this discussion doesn't end in the year 1999. That was a long time ago, and much has happened since. So let us continue. In 2001, Nintendo would finally release a completely new generation of handheld, the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance was 32-bit, and its performance and game library was most similar to the Super Nintendo level of console, rather than seeing the likes of games that you'd get on the Sega Saturn or PlayStation, which is what most people think of when it comes to 32-bit systems. Now, before we dive too far into all things Game Boy Advance, we do actually need to take a step back a year or two, as there was two half-step rivals to Nintendo that do need to be mentioned. Whilst Sega wouldn't release a true successor to the Game Gear, 1998 saw the Dreamcast released, and with it they launched their innovative Visual Memory Unit, or VMU. The VMU was a memory card that plugged into the Dreamcast controller, much like a Nintendo 64 memory card plugged into the N64 pad. But the difference was, it featured a screen that could be displayed in the middle of the controller during gameplay. More than that, when taken out of the controller, the memory card featured a D-pad and buttons, which effectively made it a mini handheld console. The games playable on the VMU were beyond basic, and its most famous use was the KO Garden game that came from Sonic Adventure on Dreamcast. This was kind of like having a Tamagotchi which could connect back into the Sonic game, and then you could take it on the go and continue when not at home. The VMU is worth noting, but it's also that it wasn't a console independent of the Dreamcast, as you could only get games and software for it by connecting it to Dreamcast and specific Dreamcast games. Sony, likewise, would take their first step into portable gaming with the Pocket Station memory card that worked pretty much the same as the VMU, but that it didn't plug into the controller. Both were significantly weaker than Game Boy, but again, for the purposes of my argument, even if you counted the VMU and Pocket Station as consoles, they don't disprove anything. They were weak systems, but the all-dominating Game Boy was weaker than all of its competition power-wise. And once again, it's not that the weakest console always wins, it's that the most powerful doesn't. So now we've had that slight diversion, what, if anything, would challenge the Game Boy Advance? The only real challenger was the Nokia N-Gage. Released in 2003, the N-Gage was actually my very first mobile telephone. Unlike the Game Boy Advance, which was seeing mostly Super Nintendo level games, and maybe if you were lucky a few Doom-like first-person shooters, or a very blocky 3D racing game or two, the N-Gage had PlayStation 1 game ports. Tomb Raider and Pandemonium were actually a couple of examples of early N-Gage games that showed off what the system was capable of. Unfortunately for Nokia, who were known as the kings of mobile phones for a period of time, they knew nothing about how to make a games console. The selling point was that this was a phone that had console quality games. Forget Snake. So, whether you wanted a phone first or a games console first, the N-Gage had you covered. In theory. Having not seen the warning signs of all those who had previously challenged Nintendo, the N-Gage was expensive, but fortunately it didn't need 6 AA batteries. The battery on the N-Gage was rechargeable, and in theory this put it ahead of the Game Boy Advance. But by this stage, Nintendo had already iterated on the Game Boy Advance with the Game Boy Advance SP edition, which was backlit, had a clamshell design, and also had a rechargeable battery. The N-Gage was disliked for the idea that you had to hold it sideways to talk into it, and it looked like a taco. I mean, I'll be honest, this never bothered me personally. Others hated it as a game system. It wasn't designed to benefit gamers. The back of the unit had to be removed and the battery taken out just to change games. This was an awful design choice. The screen was also vertically orientated, whereas almost all games of the time were orientated horizontally. This meant that playing Sonic the Hedgehog on the system was a bit of a nightmare, as you couldn't see far enough in front of Sonic to make any jumps. And also, the console didn't have dedicated action buttons, and instead all you had was a D-pad on the left, and on the right you had a numerical keypad. This meant that you had 12 buttons all on top of each other. Although this wasn't the first console that had a numerical keypad, as the Intellivision, ColecoVision, and some Atari consoles, including the Atari Jaguar, had numerical pads in the past. But there was a reason why this design choice was abandoned. With the N-Gage failing to create a rival to the Game Boy Advance, once again we learned that power doesn't win. But Nintendo were about to get their biggest rival in the console space ever. In 2004, Sony launched the PlayStation Portable, or PSP. Coming during an era of the PS2, so many people saw the PSP and assumed that Sony would finally be the ones to topple the mighty Nintendo and Game Boy and dominate the handheld market. Sony certainly would bring the fight to Nintendo's portables like never before, as Sony by this stage were very good at what they did. The PSP once again used the same tactic as all that challenged the Game Boy before it, and produced a console that's completely decimated the Game Boy Advance power-wise. Whilst people may have expected the PSP to be a portable PS1, it was so much more powerful, and it was in fact closer to being a portable PS2, and that's crazy. Sony also used a similar tactic to what they used for the PS2 and would later use for the PS3, and that is to entice people to the device by also being a media player. The PSP used UMD discs, which were small discs that were housed in a shell to protect them. Just as the PS2 was also a DVD player, and the PS3 would play Blu-rays, the UMD format meant movies could be released on the platform and make the PSP the perfect companion to take with you on flights or on holiday to watch films as well as play games. Whilst ideas of UMDs being playable on other devices never came to fruition, the offer of movies as well as games certainly was a smart move by Sony. The rise of streaming platforms like Netflix and smartphones that could have apps of the still relatively new YouTube meant that the long-term appeal of buying discs of films to watch on the go would fade with the PSP generation. Whilst the PSP may have gone the tried and tested but usually failed route of dominating with power, and whilst the console would debut at $249.99 US, the momentum of the PlayStation brand was at an all-time high. Would this be enough for them to break the curse and power win the console war? Sony did one thing that was smart with the PS1, PS2, and now with the PSP, which previous competitors didn't. They marketed their consoles for an older market. Sony's console may have been more expensive than any handheld that had ever been successful before, but their target demographic was people who were old enough to be able to afford to buy it for themselves. The Sony PlayStation Portable would go on to sell around 80 million consoles, which is completely on par with the Game Boy Advance. So there we have it. Power can succeed, and we clock up the first tie in this exploration. But, as I'm sure everyone knows, the battle wasn't between the PSP and the Game Boy Advance. Now, maybe Nintendo's spidey sense was tingling, but in 2004, Nintendo pretty much shocked everyone with the announcement of the new handheld.
Well, the wait is over. This is Nintendo DS.
The Nintendo DS was Nintendo's move to combat the PSP. An initial reaction to it was positive, but not enough so that people still weren't writing Nintendo off. Well, some people anyway. Not me. Nintendo themselves said that the Nintendo DS was a third pillar to sit next to the GameCube and Game Boy Advance. Nintendo weren't sure of the success of the DS and didn't want to say it would replace it, although that is exactly what it did. The DS was the start of their blue ocean approach to the industry. Nintendo had always known that making powerful handhelds was a recipe for disaster, But now they were making a portable console that was similar in power to the Nintendo 64 just 3 years after the Game Boy Advance launched, which was kind of Super Nintendo-esque. Going by the original Game Boy's sub-NES level of power being successful for a decade, Nintendo perhaps could have expected to ride the Game Boy Advance wave for longer. Side by side, it was blatantly obvious that the PSP was much more powerful than the DS. If the Nintendo DS was an N64, the PSP was a PS2, and the PS2 was thrashing the GameCube. So what chance did the Nintendo DS have? Well, at $100 less than the PSP, the Nintendo DS certainly had the price advantage. It may not have been compatible with movie discs, but another advantage was that the DS was compatible with Game Boy Advance cartridges, which added value to anyone who either already had a Game Boy Advance or hadn't got one yet. Many will look at this as a main factor, but it's far from that simple. The DS captured people's imaginations based on innovation. The dual screens of the DS was a callback to the two screens of the Game & Watch LCD games, and built off the clamshell design of the Game Boy Advance SP as well. For most people, two screens was a new idea, and then Nintendo made one of them a touchscreen that worked with either your finger or, for the best results, with a stylus. Nintendo took what the Gamecom had attempted back in 1997, but they did it right. Touchscreen games would open up the DS as a user-friendly console and attract many people who weren't traditional gamers. Nintendo also realised that games on the go needed to be designed around short bursts of play. This was in comparison to the PSP aiming for home console level games on the go. Just as Tetris was a game that you could pick up and play for a few minutes here or there back in 1989, Nintendo released Brain Training, or Brain Age depending where in the world you come from, which would give a few minutes of gameplay to train your brain each day. Drawing boxes and writing numbers that the console could read was revolutionary. And the game just wanting a few minutes of your time each day meant that players would keep returning to it for a long time. Nintendo also took the Tamagotchi concept to the next level with Nintendogs and gave players a virtual puppy they could actually pet and stroke, thanks to the touchscreen. Once again, the gameplay was tailored around short bursts where you'd come back day after day. But it wasn't all just the Touch Generation series of games. Nintendo still had Pokemon. For years, people said that at some point Pikachu and pals would fade as a popular brand. But it never has. The Nintendo DS would go on to sell 154 million consoles worldwide, which is close to double the number of PSPs sold. Now, if Nintendo had actually just stuck out the original DS for another 1 or 2 million consoles sold, it would have overtaken the PS2 to be the most successful console of all time. By no means can the PSP be seen as a failure, but once again we have a much less powerful console in the DS beating its competition. Surely at this stage, and as discussed in my other video about the most powerful home consoles rarely if never winning, all console makers must have been able to see the pattern and not continue to make the same errors, right? Well, imagine working at Sony and pitching that the next console should aim to be less powerful than whatever Nintendo is cooking up. That would seem insane. Of course, they would go for power. Something that is interesting as a difference between the handheld and console market that makes this discussion slightly trickier is that companies more frequently revise the handheld hardware than they do home consoles. I mean, sure, we may get redesigns like the NES Top Loader or a PS2 Slim, but they are essentially the same console. Just as the Game Boy Color added color, and with it there were games that didn't work on the black and white Game Boy, and therefore were Game Boy Color exclusive, the DS was updated with the DSi. This removed the Game Boy Advance slot, added a camera, and also added an eShop for the first time so that you could download exclusive games that weren't compatible on the regular DS. Power wasn't changed, but features were added. New iterations don't always go as well, as the Game Boy Micro was tiny but couldn't play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games and came out close to the launch of the DS. As such, it failed and was a sad end to the Game Boy line. This was merely a blip though, and although it didn't sell tons, it wasn't a new console with exclusive games, so Nintendo could just chalk that one up to, oh well, the DS is doing great. Likewise, Sony launched the PSP Go, which took away the UMD drive and was an all-digital console long before people were ready for one, which they arguably still are not. Still, there are lessons to be learned from what consumers will or will not buy, and that came down to timing, cost, and value proposition. Both the Game Boy Micro and PSP Go were smaller consoles, but they had more limited libraries of games that could be played than the consoles they were spinning off from, and people also saw that the true successors were coming. The handheld market hasn't really followed the same generational pattern as home consoles, and the only lineage of Game Boy to Pocket to Color to Advance to DS has shown the development of the generations. Everything else, there was stuff from Atari, stuff from Sega, Neo Geo, eventually PlayStation, and none of them were true successors to each other, even though they all came from various generations. Next up, we have the Nintendo 3DS versus the PlayStation Vita. The 3DS would be the successor to the Nintendo DS, and the PlayStation Vita would be the successor to the PSP, and the first true successor to a non-Nintendo handheld. Things wouldn't go as well as hoped for either console, at least not at first. Just as Sony had made the PSP kind of on level with the PS2, the PlayStation Vita wouldn't be a million miles away from the current PS3, even if it wasn't quite at the level of the home console. The 3DS, meanwhile, was more capable of producing games at the level of the PS2, GameCube, or OG Xbox. Both the 3DS and PlayStation Vita would cost the same price of $249.99 US at launch. So who would win? Sony showed the world that the much more powerful PSP could sell tens of millions, but if only half of what the DS sold. Could they build on this and catch up or even overtake Nintendo? The answer is no. Sony released very impressive hardware, but with every silver lining there was a cloud. Sony abandoned the UMD format for postage stamp sized game cards. Instantly, this meant that the Vita was not backwards compatible with the PSP, where the 3DS was backwards compatible with all the DS games. Well, it is worth noting that you could download PSP and PS1 games that were on both the PSP and Vita stores and play on the Vita, but herein was the next issue for Sony. The PlayStation Vita had insanely expensive memory cards. If you wanted a 32GB or 64GB card, you could pay up to about £80 or more for it. I don't even think they actually officially released the 64GB card in the UK. Now, they may have avoided the fairly standard SD or micro SD card because of fear of hacking or piracy, but the perception was that the more expensive console would be even more expensive if you bought the required memory cards. Nintendo once again trumped them by allowing you to use standard and cheaper SD cards. You could also get the Vita as either a Wi-Fi or 3G focused system, and if you wanted the 3G console, you'd have further costs for playing online. This did little to help the Vita, and it actually created fodder for negative headlines about all of the extra costs involved if you wanted the full Vita experience. Both the Vita and the 3DS focused on innovative features. The Vita had a touchscreen and a touch panel on the back of the console. It featured cameras, motion controls, and it also had 2 analog sticks, whereas the PSP only had 1. The 3DS also had cameras, motion controls, and its biggest innovation, glasses-free 3D display. With this generation, it can be argued that both consoles had features that drove up the cost and weren't what people cared about. The back touch panel in the Vita was cool, and the 3G connectivity sounded great, and the cameras were not exploited much. Look, none of these were really essential, but definitely added to the cost. The 3D effect on the 3DS wasn't something you could show people properly unless they saw the console in person, and Nintendo made it a policy that games couldn't require to be in 3D. The 3D effect was also not perfect in the first iteration of the console, with a limited viewing angle, and Nintendo would warn players not to play with the 3D slider on for a long period of time. With the expensive costs of these systems and nice but not necessary features, both started to sink. At the time, people primarily look at one explanation for why the handheld consoles were bombing, and that was the rise of the iPhone, iPad, and Android phones and tablets.
Question has arisen lately. Is there room for a third category of device in the middle?
The logic was simple. If people were going to carry a device around with them, why would they fork out for the 3DS or Vita when they already have an iPhone which they could play Angry Birds on? The Tiger Gamecom had introduced a touchscreen into games consoles before the DS, but it was probably the DS that had got the world ready for touchscreens on phones and tablets that looked to be the end of the handheld console business. Add to this that most people would now have mobile phones anyway, and if they had a mobile phone in their pocket, even if it cost many more times that of a 3DS or PlayStation Vita, because they'd have it anyway, it effectively meant they kind of had a free handheld gaming console already in their pocket. But it was something that also came with the functions of a phone, connecting to the internet, watching YouTube, reading Kindle books, using it as a torch, and everything else you can do on a smartphone. The timing and technology was right for the iPhone and Android to move into the gaming space, whereas the Nokia N-Gage was too ambitious and ahead of its time in this regard. So, many people predicted the end of the 3DS and Vita and handheld gaming overall in the face of smartphones. Those people were wrong. New phones came out every year, but handheld and home consoles wouldn't get a new generation or a refresh until every 4 to 6 years. This meant that very quickly, phones were overtaking the 3DS and catching up to the Vita in terms of power and capability. Phone or tablet technology has moved so quick that if we were to count them in this discussion as being a handheld gaming console, we would have to go from the first iPhones being the underdog against the more powerful Nintendo and Sony consoles to the reverse of that, where they were much more powerful. And if we counted them in this discussion as such, then it would be that power ends up winning. So, what advantages did Sony and Nintendo have? Several. Whilst games on an app store are usually much cheaper than those on consoles, the games available on smartphones were a callback to the issues of the Atari 2600. With next to no quality control, the app stores were flooded with garbage. Add to this that touch controls are generally lacking on their own compared to controls with tactile buttons, D-pads and analog sticks. Well, this meant there could be higher quality games on the 3DS and Vita. Finally, it was that Nintendo and Sony had a much stronger lineup of franchises, first-party games, and better developers working on games than what you'd get on phones and tablets. The idea of phone games completely replacing home consoles and handheld consoles eventually would somewhat wear off as it became evident that people still wanted dedicated gaming consoles. Nintendo during this period also released the Wii U, and with both that and the 3DS flopping, they took drastic measures to cut the 3DS price and get a slew of heavy-hitting games on the 3DS. Mario Kart 7, New Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario 3D Land all came to save the day. The era of Nintendogs and Brain Age were past, and Nintendo used the combination of Animal Crossing and Pokemon to again set the Nintendo ship back in motion. Eventually, the 3DS would sell in the region of 75 million consoles, which was a success, but half the success the Nintendo DS had had. Things were even sadder for the PlayStation Vita, which is somewhat mysterious sales data. Sony has been tight-lipped about the actual figures, but from what I understand, it's about 15 million consoles, or maybe even slightly more. Sony didn't sort out the memory card cost issues and still had a focus on getting handheld versions of epic console games like Uncharted or Killzone onto the handheld. Smaller indie games would eventually be the thing that really thrived on Vita, but this would seemingly call an end to Sony's entry into the handheld market. Seemingly. Whilst it was once again the case that the less powerful console in the 3DS had triumphed over the more powerful PlayStation Vita, there was definitely a huge decline in how many people were buying handheld consoles. If we count the various tablets from Apple and Samsung in the conversation, we could say they were more powerful and they won the day. Therefore, my argument would be over, and it would be that the most powerful system won. But, it wouldn't be fair to count the iPad, etc. in this race. Modern phones and tablets are not consoles, and although they definitely do compete for your gaming time, and you may decide just to take an iPad for entertainment rather than a Vita, they're closer in conversation to a laptop than a gaming console. That doesn't mean we can't reference them in terms of why an actual handheld or home console may do better or worse. If the iPad is affecting sales, then it is a tiny part of the conversation at least. Nintendo would eventually make the 3DS a success, and they would iterate on it with the new Nintendo 3DS that added a second stick, well, kind of. It added better 3D and was a more powerful console, so that a couple of new Nintendo 3DS games would only work on it as exclusives. Their next step would surprise people, as they would then downgrade the 3DS.
Introducing the newest member of the Nintendo 3DS family. Meet Nintendo 2DS,
which had no 3D effect and was no longer folded like a clamshell. They would then upgrade that, but still without the 3D, to have the new Nintendo 2DS, which was just a non-3D new Nintendo 3DS. It gets very confusing. Just as we reached a point where the Game Boy stood alone in the handheld universe and ruled over all, the time came where the same was true for the 3DS. Nintendo had once again won. That is, until they challenged themselves again. After the failure of the Wii U, Nintendo launched the Nintendo Switch, which consolidated their handheld and home console efforts into one device. Some saw this as Nintendo exiting the home console market, and others saw it as the end of handheld gaming. It was neither of these. At the time of writing, Nintendo is still on track to give the Nintendo DS and even the PS2 a run for its money, with the Nintendo Switch potentially becoming the #1 selling gaming device of all time. Depending how soon Nintendo pull the trigger on showing off the successor to the Switch, we'll know if that happens or not. Nintendo would release the Nintendo Switch Lite, which is a dedicated handheld version of the Switch. Even if the hybrid nature of the Switch positions it as both a home and handheld console, the Lite shows that Nintendo are still interested and, in fact, dedicated to handheld gaming. With no rival, is it fair to say that the Switch is the most powerful console and won? Well, With a period of no rivals comes opportunities for outsiders to step up, just as SNK, Tiger and Bandai did back in the late 90s. Now, I am aware that I have skipped over a few handhelds that entered the market over the years, such as the GP32, the Barcode Battler and the Neo Geo X. AtGames would release mini handheld versions of the Master System and Mega Drive, which I didn't touch on because all of these devices are kind of non-factors that either just got very limited, tiny releases in random countries, or were just nostalgia-based clone consoles. If the Nintendo Switch became the handheld power leader upon its release in 2017, perhaps I should look to what may have entered the space, even if it doesn't seem like it was trying to compete. The Evercade launched in 2020, and people who watch my channel will know I have covered it quite a bit. It is unquestionably a much weaker console than Switch, and although its library of games is 90% focused on classic games from old consoles that are being emulated, it does have a library of indie games and is starting to get some original software. Blaze, who make the console, are a small company, and so this is no fairy tale of a new underpowered console on the block beating Nintendo at their own game. They occupy a different section of the market and have their own loyal fan base. Likewise, there is the Playdate. At first glance, it looks like a squared off Game Boy Pocket, and it has a crank attached to the side. With a black and white screen and games that are downloaded from an app store, the indie console doesn't have a mass release, and though insanely underpowered compared to the Switch, it again isn't remotely trying to compete with it. If you said the Playdate, the Evercade, or even the Analog Pocket, which is a handheld designed to play old Game Boy, Game Gear and Lynx games, were competing, you could say that power wins. But the story, though close to an end, is not over yet. In 2022, Valve released the Steam Deck, a premium device that comes from a big enough company that it would be fair to say that it is competing with the Switch. The Steam Deck allows you to play a huge amount of games that are available through Steam, which is the biggest online platform for computer users to buy games. Instantly, the Steam Deck has a much bigger library than the Switch. It can also be used as a PC with either Steam OS, or you could install Windows or whatever other operating system on it you like, and it's Valve's biggest step into the hardware business after the unsuccessful attempt with Steam machines. The question is the Steam Deck a gaming console, or is it a portable computer? By its design, it is much closer to being a console. It features just about the same inputs as you would expect on a modern handheld gaming console. It's very similar to the Switch in several ways, and although it can be used in desktop mode, its default mode is more like a console interface. Now, I'm happy for you to raise points and debate in the comments if the Steam Deck should be counted in this discussion, but for me, for this exploration, I would say it satisfies what I think is needed for it to count as a more powerful rival to Switch. An awful lot of the games media does seem to put it into the category as being a rival to the Switch, although I will note that it hasn't had a wide release as Sony, Nintendo and Microsoft consoles usually do, in that you kind of have to order it and you can't just go and pick it up off the store shelves. At least not that I'm aware of. But perhaps this is just a sign of changing times. Counting the Steam Deck as a more powerful console than the Switch, it cannot compete with Switch as things are. This is primarily in terms of cost. Even with various models of the Steam Deck available that have different specs, the cost is much more than that of the Nintendo Switch. Other handheld gaming computers are starting to enter the market, such as the Ayaneo or Ayaneo, I don't know how it's pronounced, I don't have one, but the Ayaneo 2, which is a much more expensive system, although on paper once again is a lot more capable than perhaps even the Steam Deck. But there is still one more thing to cover. Sony have shown off Project Q. Now, won't this be funny once Project Q gets a new name, and forever this video is going to be dogged down by calling whatever this Sony device is by its code name, Project Q. At first glance, it looks like a PS5 controller with a screen in the middle. Many thought it was going to be a portable PS5 or a Vita 2, but in reality, it is only capable of remote play so that you can stream off of your PS5 to play PS5 games on the device if it is in the same Wi-Fi network. From what is currently known, the Project Q unit cannot be used without it being also connected to a PS5, so again it perhaps shouldn't be counted as a handheld console. If you did, you'd have to count the PS5 specs as part of it, and again the more powerful console in the PS5 combined with Project Q would have lost to the Nintendo Switch. But I wouldn't go as far as to count the Project Q in this discussion, other than anecdotally. Just as I will have said towards the end of the video that focused on home consoles, we're in a strange time where console designations are blurred. And that includes which generation a console is in, and whether certain consoles should count as a handheld or not. In the case of the current generation, every contender has a question mark, such as the Switch being a hybrid, the Evercade and Analog Pocket being emulation focused, and the Steam Deck and the Ayaneo being computers, and the Project Q just effectively being a backbone with a built-in screen instead of using your phone. The Playdate is perhaps the most pure and only one that is indisputably a handheld console with an original game library. So yeah, Playdate wins! But wait, I forgot the Game Gear Micro.
60周年を記念してミニを超えるミクロサイズにゲームギアミクロ
Nah. Switch wins even though it has less power than the Steam Deck. Theory stays intact. So, have we reached the end? For now it would seem so, but the story will continue with future generations. I've loved seeing the response to the home console discussion and hope you find this one as interesting. I look forward to seeing lots of comments which highlight things I may not have considered and other perspectives on the topic. I think with these explorations into how or why the most powerful consoles never seem to win the console wars, there are definitely many reasons. With the handheld side of things, it has been first and foremost about power, causing a high cost and reduced battery life. Later in different generations, it was that Nintendo had Pokemon and other games that were too compelling to beat. Before I completely wrap up this discussion, I will pose what I may explore in a third part, and that is what we learn if we don't separate the home and handheld consoles out from one another. I think that would be even more revealing of the theory that power doesn't win the console wars. So, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and until next time, I will kindly ask you to smash that subscribe button, hit the thumbs up, the notification bell, and please leave a comment. I love chatting with you in the comments on the last video and every video, so it'd be cool to do that again this time. Also, this really helps let YouTube know to share out the video, and it will help the channel grow so I can keep making more of these documentaries and explorations. This is the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel, and if you want to check out an article version of this or any of the videos and tons of other gaming related articles, do check out my website at www.extremed.tv. Until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom, and we're off the air.